Welcome to 10 Minutes on US Nuclear Weapons on UK Soil from the Joint Public Issues team. I'm Annie, and I'm one of the JPIT interns this year, and I'll be talking to Steve, who's one of our policy advisors. We'll be talking about the risk that US nuclear weapons may be brought to the UK and stationed on UK soil. But first, we've got Ukraine and Russia in our news and on our minds. So Rishi Sunak has said this week that the world is closer to a dangerous nuclear escalation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Is this right, Steve? Are we moving towards nuclear war with Russia?
I think when Rishi said closer, I think that's right. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're close. Fortunately, we are, though, in a more uncertain and dangerous place than we've been for decades. It's not just about Ukraine. Ukraine, I think, has brought things to a head, but the bigger risk is around the way in which governments, in which we as a global community perceive nuclear weapons today. During the Cold War, we were quite clear, and it was very sobering, that the use of nuclear weapons would bring about the end of civilization as we know it. However, I think that today we have to be concerned about the development of smaller nuclear weapons by countries like the US, the UK, and Russia. The risk is that we consider these what are called theater nuclear weapons as usable because the impact of a single weapon, while it's still devastating, has been reduced. But the problem with this thinking is that once a small nuclear weapon is used, there's no obvious route to de-escalation. There's a theoretical belief among nuclear powers around the credibility of deterrence, and this sort of incentivizes states to reciprocate threats to show that they're serious. So the danger is that you end up in the same place. Even if you start out with a small nuclear weapon, there's no clear policy thinking as to how you avoid an all-out nuclear war. Once the nuclear genie is out of the bottle, we simply don't know where we might end up.
And President Putin has moved Russian nuclear weapons to a combat readiness and made various threats to the US and NATO. How should we respond to Putin's nuclear threats?
With caution, but I don't think that we need to scare ourselves too much. All governments, including our own government, are ambiguous regarding the circumstances in which nuclear weapons might be used. The loudest voices coming out of Russia, of course, are the nuclear hawks, who are prepared to talk up the use of nuclear weapons. The majority of Russian officials, at least I hope they might be a majority, might be just as worried about these statements from the hawks as you or I. President Biden and Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, have actually responded fairly well in my view. It would be quite feasible for them to match the Russian rhetoric on nuclear weapons, to do a sort of President Trump, the sort of my nuclear button is bigger than yours type response. Fortunately, they've gone in exactly the opposite direction. When Russia has talked up its nuclear threat, the West has been more likely to respond with reassurance. We've repeated, for example, what is known as the Reagan-Gorbachev dictum, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
So does this depend on the personalities and the position of the President or NATO Secretary General?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a very relevant question, seeing as we've got a US election coming up, so we don't know where Biden might be in a year's time. Jens Stoltenberg only has got a few months left in his job as NATO Secretary General. What matters most is that in global politics we can maintain a strong stigma against nuclear weapons use and against their maintenance, and to continue towards disarmament. Unfortunately, recently we've seen the end of the INF Treaty withdrawn by President Trump. We've seen the suspension of talks between the US and Russia on an extension to New START that expires in 2025. We've seen, unfortunately, the failure of the NPT review conferences in both 2015 and then again in 2021. This is the first time in 3 decades that the NPT review conference has failed twice consecutively. And the prospect of it failing again in 2026, unfortunately, is quite high. All of this is bad news because possibly it does mean that if we've got a weakened nuclear arms control regime, then yes, under those circumstances, maybe we are left with the randomness of the wisdom or lack of it on the part of a few key personalities who just happen to be in the position of heads of state at any one time.
So our churches have been part of a global movement that helped to bring in the Treaty on the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. How does that affect all of this? But our churches have been part of a global movement that helped to bring in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. How does that affect all of this?
Well, it does affect it positively. The problem being that nuclear weapons states tend to oppose this policy. That is the case with our own government. This, in the UK's case, relates to our addiction to the retention of UK nuclear weapons policy, which is partly connected with how successive governments have perceived our role and our status in the world. Nevertheless, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is really important. It is the only global narrative among governments at the moment that is strongly condemning nuclear weapons and urging that we engage in the really hard work of working out how we achieve disarmament. So at Joint Public Issues Team, we are suggesting that people could ask questions of prospective parliamentary candidates at general elections hustings. We might ask, for example, should the UK support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? I think the UK could and should do more to talk with the majority of countries in the world that support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They support less resource money being spent off nuclear weapons, more action on climate change, and our attempts as a global community to address common threats that affect us all.
And in 2008, the UK got rid of US nuclear weapons from our country. What's happening now at RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk? Are they being reintroduced?
Well, it looks as if they are. So the US government have built new facilities at RAF Lakenheath for the storage of US nuclear weapons. These are the sort of smaller theatre nuclear weapons that we were talking about earlier, but which unfortunately are equally dangerous. Back in 2008, there was huge public campaign and demonstrations to get US nuclear weapons removed from British soil, and those were successful. And nuclear sharing between countries is a big issue diplomatically for disarmament efforts around the world. So, for example, we're not particularly happy, are we, about Russian moving some of its nuclear weapons to Belarus? So you've got to imagine how that might be perceived on the other side if the US, at this point of heightened tensions, then move their weapons back to the UK. It undermines attempts that are going on diplomatically around the world to reduce nuclear threats. Unfortunately, in Parliament, when MPs ask questions on RAF Lakenheath, the government doesn't want to discuss it, and it refuses to provide a response to Parliament. This is a further example of how the UK's nuclear weapons policy undermines some aspects of our democratic system. I would say that there is a very legitimate public interest here. We, as the public, we are not dumb. This should be a part of a grown-up national debate, and the excuse of secrecy around nuclear policy should not be used by the government to suppress this debate.
So what can we do about it then?
Well, I think quite simply, we don't take no for an answer. We can still ask our MP for their opinion on the arrival of new nuclear weapons on UK soil. I think this would be, again, especially important for us to do in an election year. For information on that and for resources for writing to MPs and taking other action, we can go to the CND website and you'll find some resources on that very prominently on the CND website's homepage.
Thanks, Steve. And thank you for listening to 10 Minutes On from the Joint Public Issues team. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it around. And you can find out more about JPIT on our website, jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk.